Dr. Clark Elliott is a professor at DePaul University. He's very diverse. He has teaching certificates in music and computer science and a Ph.D. in computer simulation for human emotions. He's the author of The Ghost in My Brain, How a Concussion Stole My Life, and How the Science of Brain Plasticity Helped Me Get It Back. Dr. Elliott was told by doctors that after he could no longer walk or talk, he really would not recover after his head injury. But with treatment, using brain plasticity principles in neuro-optometric treatment, he is now fully recovered. Please help me welcome Dr. Clark Elliott.
Hi, I'm Dr. Clark Elliott from DePaul University in Chicago. The book I wrote is called The Ghost in My Brain, How a Concussion Stole My Life, and How the New Science of Brain Plasticity Helped Me Get It Back. There are many additional resources at the clarkelliott.com website, and I'd like to call your attention in particular to the many reader comments having to do with optometry. I spent almost a decade living with brain injury. And yet I'm one of the very few who ever recovered from this kind of long-term injury. And I know how I got better and why I got better. So The Ghost was written with three purposes in mind. The first was to capture the experience of a brain injury, one person's life, the real story of one person's life with brain injury. I took notes, perversely, from the first day of the injury, ultimately comprising almost 1,200 pages of notes, even though there was no expectation that I would ever recover. As a scientist, I was fascinated by the many bizarre episodes I experienced, so I wrote them down precisely as they happened. Second, I wanted to be a champion for neuro-optometric brain rehabilitation techniques. These are based on hard science. For example, I give 700 references to scholarly articles relevant to neurodevelopmental optometry at that clarkelliott.com website. In addition, the context-free visual puzzles that helped me so much were based on the work of Reuven Feuerstein, who has more than 1,700 scholarly references to his original work. This is hard science, and these techniques work. Lastly, I wanted the book to be a celebration of the human machine. The human brain is the most powerful computational device on Earth, by far. This is roughly equivalent in computational power, one human brain, to all of the computers between here and Chicago, something like 50 million desktop computers. If we laid them end to end, they would stretch from here to Beijing, China, with another 3,000 or 4,000 miles to go. That's a lot of computing power, and much of that is devoted to visual processing, as we'll see. There was a quirk in the nature of my injury that allowed me to observe my brain operating in slow motion, and often I could see its complexity, its resilience, and ultimately its ability to reconfigure itself. My recovery was effected by two brilliant Chicago area researcher clinicians. Donna Marcus, a cognitive restructuring specialist who uses paper and pencil visual exercises to restore brain function, paper and pencils. And Deborah Zielinski, a name that I believe is familiar to many of you, an optometrist who uses neurodevelopmental rehabilitation techniques and prescription eyeglasses to restore brain function. We might ask, are such case studies valid? I'm a professor of artificial intelligence and cognitive science trained in brain theory. I'm also one of the authors of the fairly major new neuroscience program being unveiled at DePaul University. I took 1,200 pages of detailed notes over the course of 8 years. There was no expectation that I would ever recover. Clinical tests were all consistent with me having a traumatic brain injury. I had every test under the sun, from CT scans to MRIs to X-rays and everything else. The best neurologists and the leading rehabilitation centers were all in absolute agreement. Possible terrorist improvement at 1 month, 6 months, a year, and 2 years. After that, no one ever improves. I was told over and over and over again, Clark Elliott, you will never recover. No one ever does. Learn to live with your symptoms. And yet, I showed dramatic improvement, by my estimate, about 70% recovery within just 3 weeks of beginning optometric and cognitive restructuring treatment, based on the miracle of how the plastic brain works. and I have full recovery after 2 years. Full recovery after 2 years. In September of 1999, I was rear-ended on my way to teach an evening class while waiting at a stoplight. I didn't think much of it at the time, although strange things began happening right away. I drove to work and gave a lecture that lasted 3 hours and then somehow found my way home. But after 3 fruitless trips to the emergency room, I was soon struggling to get through just a single day. My life was spiraling out of control from this concussion. I had persistent symptoms for more than 8 years. I was almost fully functional until I had to think. And then I suffered severe deterioration within minutes, and this is a hallmark of concussion that you may see in your patients. I had an inability to initiate action, a form of catatonia. For example, I couldn't rise from a chair without help. I often had to be helped from a room after a meeting. I could walk upstairs, but not down them. I couldn't pass through doorways because I couldn't see them. I couldn't feel them. I couldn't tell the difference between my body and the door frame, and I had to have students push me out into the hall so I could get on my way. I could write after a fashion, but I couldn't read. I couldn't read at all for almost 6 months, but I diligently took notes on scraps of paper and on Post-it notes and in random computer files. I almost froze to death several times crossing Grant Park after an evening lecture when my body just stopped moving. It would run slower and slower, and the distant horizon would get farther and farther away. Ultimately, I stopped moving altogether. And I thought, as I'm standing there in this sub-freezing weather with the icy wind blowing by off of the lake, this is it. I'm going to die. So this is stupid. Just get moving. But there was nothing I could do. I had difficult balance problems. I couldn't take elevators. I would pour myself out into the hall if I did because I couldn't walk. I couldn't take trains without vomiting. My visual system had to take over for my damaged vestibular system so that I could stay upright. My eyes had to take over for my ears. But this caused competition for scant visual spatial resources, which were also themselves damaged. The result was loss of balance and intense nausea within 5 minutes of beginning any task that required visualization, such as listening to speech and trying to interpret what people were saying, or just thinking. I could think or stand up, but I couldn't do both at the same time. We don't like to talk about pain, but this is common with head injury. After 20 minutes of just, say, something like balancing my checkbook, I would fill the tub with cold water and party bags of ice from 7-Eleven and down in it, trying to deal with the neck and head pain. I had a complete inability to make decisions. I was perfectly logical in the normal way. I had good assessment, as always. But if you held up your 2 hands in front of me and said, "Clark, pick your left hand or your right hand," I couldn't do it. If you said, "I'll give you $1,000 and I don't care which hand you pick," I couldn't do it. There was just nothing there. It's like age-related memory deterioration when you're trying to remember the name of that movie star and you know it's in there, but you just can't think of the name. I had no ability to multitask at all. I could only do one thing at a time or my body would simply freeze up. I was given this line drawing by Donnelly Marcus when I first saw her. And I told her, "Donnelly, this is going to be tricky for me." And she said, "I need to see how you do anyway." So as I was copying that off to a spare blank 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper, my body started to contort, and my eye got down about an inch away from the paper, and my hand was crumpling up the original. And Donnelly's assistant in the background was waving her arms and saying, "911, 911, should I call 911? And we laughed about it later. And Donnelly told me the only reason I didn't call an ambulance is I was worried you're going to fall on the floor in these horrible contortions just from copying that drawing, was that while it was going on, I had this voiceover saying, "Well, Donnelly, this always happens. Don't worry about it. It's no big deal. My life is like this all the time." So we went with it and managed to finish that first session. If I drew concentric circles like these, or squares, or performed some kind of optic rotations such as required for photocopying two-sided documents, I would end up with these side-to-side seizures like this that sometimes would go on for three days, up to 3 days. I had difficult audio processing difficulties. I could not turn speech into meaning fast enough to keep up with what people were saying to me. I had extreme photosensitivity that would leave me often doubled over on the sidewalk or in the street or in a room, holding my ears, trying to get away from the sound. I had no ability to plan. Time and calendars had no inherent meaning for me at all. If someone said, "Clark, I'll see you at 4:30 on Tuesday," it meant nothing to me. I'd see 4:30, and I thought, I don't know what this means. I used to know what it meant. And I'd try to write it down and hope they wouldn't go on talking, and then later try to figure out what it meant. I retained the cardinality property of numbers such that 5 means there's a collection of 5 things. I could still understand that. But I lost their ordinality, so I no longer understood that 3 was less than 4, and 4 was less than 5. Without ordinality, we don't have ordering. Without ordering, we lose sequence. And of course, without sequence, we can't plan at all. I lost my sensory filters. I could not stop incoming sounds and visual patterns, such as from my early vision system, nor could I stop attempting to process them. I couldn't turn off the spigot. I was overwhelmed by this unfiltered sensory input that cannot be turned off at all. It's like having a bell lowered over your head and someone beating on it with a sledgehammer. It leads to what I can only call just madness. You want to run from it. You want to run for your life, but you can't get away from it, and you can't turn it off. And above all is this alienation that is so pervasive. It's a private joke among concussives. Welcome to life as an alien. Welcome to life as an exile from the human race. This feeling is intense, it's pervasive, and it's permanent. I long to be human one more time. I longed even just to have a bad day. A bad day would be such a blessing if I could have a bad day as a human being again. To return home, but with the realization that it would never, ever happen again. And all of these are common with concussions. Most people with concussion that are living through this won't talk about it. You won't know. They'll be hiding it. And yet, in my case, I was lucky. In January of 2008, we began my transformation back to a real human being. I had treatment that emphasized neuroplasticity in 2 ways. First, we used context-free visual puzzles. Remember those paper and pencil puzzles? To rebuild cognitive pathways. And I worked with Donna Lee Marcus on these puzzles. Second, I had prescription eyeglasses, plain old prescription eyeglasses of the kind that you prescribe every day. And this was to emphasize healthy pathways to the visual cortex and avoid damaged areas. And this was with a name that you probably know, Deborah Zielinski, the optometrist just north of Chicago. I want to note here that I never had vision therapy, at least classic vision therapy, but I believe that the context-free visual puzzles probably filled those roles in my treatment. And also, of course, Debbie Zielinski works within the principles of vision therapy. She just goes about it a different way. The visual spatial brain is profound. Estimates in my business as a cognitive scientist and an AI scientist, the estimates I see are that 50 to even 80% of the brain gets involved in visual spatial processing. Remember that device we mentioned early on that is comprised of 50 million desktop computers? 50 to 80% of that is devoted to your business, visual spatial processing. And that's why you are in the right business. You are not only the future of treatment of brain injury, you are the future of neuroscience. We are primarily visual spatial beings from the ground up. This is the basis of sensory interpretation and symbolic thought. You have all the power in the next decades to come. This kind of brain allows us to reason, to know we exist in the world, to understand meaning and language, and to understand relationships. These are all visual spatial processes, and these processes are linked to motor coordination, memory, balance, body sense, and of course, hearing. We have roughly 60 million input receptors in each retina operating in real time. This is massive sensory input that the brain has to handle. And this is unfortunately the part of the brain that is most often affected by concussion. Brain plasticity. The brain is largely considered now in the modern world to be of general purpose design and adaptable. Healthy brain real estate can take over processing for parts that have been damaged, and that was the miracle that gave me back my life. We can think of it as in the following way. Deborah Zielinski used standard neuro-optometric testing techniques that we'll see in a minute to find healthy tissue in my brain. And then she redirected my retinal input using prescription eyeglasses to that healthy tissue. She created what we might think of as dirt roads through this healthy tissue in my brain. And then using paper and pencil puzzles, we continually rehearsed symbolic processing and pushed my brain along those new pathways. Marcus thus turned the dirt roads that we had created into superhighways that again supported the visual spatial reasoning needed for my work as a professor of artificial intelligence. Here's just one of the many kinds of brain puzzles I worked on with Donna Lee. In the upper left, you see a collection of dots and various orientations of squares. And from those dots, I had to fill in the 3D objects down in the lower right-hand corner. And I worked on these over and over again for 6 months, every day. Now, keep in mind, when I started working on these visual puzzles, Donna Lee said, "Clark, here are 3 dots. It's a triangle. I want you to trace the triangle. Go home and practice a triangle. And when you get that, we'll work up to a square." I also had optometric treatment, prescription eyeglasses, ultimately 6 pairs over 3 years, although the last year was tweaking. I was fully recovered after 2 years. The neuro-optometric testing I underwent in the first 3 hours there with Deborah Zielinski is filled with tests that you probably recognize. Bill Padula's visual midline shift test, King-Devick, the Lang stereo test 2, the Yoke prism walk, and so on. And we were addressing 3 categories of retinal input with this testing. First, we wanted to look at my center vision pathway. Next, my peripheral vision pathway and pathways. How was my peripheral vision operating? And lastly, the very, very important, the critically important non-image forming retinal pathways, which I will mention also. Daniel Lish has said, Kish has said that we hear in 3 dimensions, we hear in 3 spaces, and let me remind you, all of that hearing in the 3D world around us gets mapped to these same visual spatial parts of the brain. It doesn't matter where the input is coming from. And in this case, the non-image forming retinal input pathways map back to those same parts of the brain. Our dime-sized center vision accounts for only maybe 1,000th of the spatial world around us, of which we are aware on many levels. It's a tiny dot on the far side of the room. It's a button in the middle of a doorknob when you're sitting on the other side of the room. But all the rest of that, the world, the visual spatial world around us, is something we have to keep track of in our brains. It sets the context for that dime-sized center vision. Neurodevelopmental optometry addresses the major portion of our visual spatial processing beyond center vision. You can't hear, you can't think, you might need glasses. Our hearing maps to spatial images because sound is given meaning through the images in our brain. If I tap a wine glass behind your right shoulder, think what you know. First, you'll recognize it's a wine glass. You might imagine the color red of the wine. You'll evoke all kinds of context level connections to other spatial images, such as that you might drink the wine with someone, and that other people could drink wine, or maybe someone's had too much. All of these are visual spatial images, and they are instantly processed as soon as you hear the sound of the wine glass. The non-image forming retinal pathways. This is a collection of pathways that set our spatial grounding in the world. They branch off to the brain and elsewhere after the retina. This sets the context. It sets the level playing field, the platform on which everything else depends. It sets the context for our peripheral awareness as well as our center vision. It's linked to balance, posture, emotion, hormones, hearing, sleep cycles, spatial awareness, and so on. All humans have the hardware to interpret these signals, including those people who've been blind from birth. We all have the same hardware. It's a crucial part of what makes us human. And I believe when this gets out of sync with the rest of our processing, it can lead to this kind of alienation that I described in the early part of the talk. Zielinski used the Z-Bell test, her Z-Bell test, at each visit to assess my non-image forming retinal processing and to link it with the 3D spatial hearing of my world, the world around me. We might say you can see 20/20, but your retinal processing is completely dysfunctional. It's common with brain injury. But how happy I am to say that you are now able to say in the modern world, but we can fix that. As an aside, I'd like to mention that my intuition, based on my experience, is that neurodevelopmental optometry can treat many of these cases, these very troubling cases of attention disorder. When peripheral processing is not working or not correctly integrated with center vision, a person must continually and vigilantly attend to all the details that set the context of their lives. They have to look at it with that dime-sized center vision because they're not getting the rest of the information. Skip Rizzo at USC, an AI scientist, has a great video of the silhouettes of attention-disordered children with these head-mounted displays and motion trackers. And you watch these heads moving around, and as you see that as optometrists, you say, oh my goodness, they're not getting any of their peripheral information. And that's why they're so like this all the time, so vigilant, trying to find out what the meaning of that center vision is, because they're not getting the normal processing. My phase 1 glasses had prisms in them. I wore them for about 30 days. We emphasized correct peripheral vision to restore my Gestalt visual scene organization and planning and executive functions. Debbie Zielinski wanted me to be comfortable in my body, first of all. She used prisms to send light to the good side of my retinas and thus pried open a working window, a window in which she could work with my brain. Within 3 weeks, the ghost of who I had been returned in this phenomenal transition back to normal after 8 years. The ghost in the title of the book refers to this period. In those first 30 days, I was like a 6-month-old baby learning the world again. I had this joyous reawakening into the world and into my body in the world. For example, I couldn't walk anymore because my body was completely reorienting itself, but you could see me at the university dancing my way down the hall. I couldn't walk, but I could dance, and I was happy. So this is okay. I'm happy. I can move again. I can feel the world. And during that time, there was a downside. There was this scary presence that started following me around about 30 feet off my right shoulder. In retrospect, I think it might have something to do with that position movement disorder that the Swiss are now studying. But in any case, my experience of it was like the secret share, Conrad's secret share. And over the course of 3 weeks in this early period, it got closer and closer to me until finally, one day outside my office in this first month, about 3 weeks after I got the glasses, I was putting my key in the office door and I realized, oh, that's me coming home. That's the guy that I remember thinking used to build boats and sail them around San Francisco Bay when he was a kid and loved mathematics so much that he rode his bicycle up to the University of California to sit in on math classes like this secret sniper. And this person that loved music so much all his life, and he could now listen to it again. That was me coming home, and I went in and put my head down on the desk and just cried tears at this great gift that had been given back to me. And I thought, thank you, Debbie Zielinski and Donnelly Marcus, that you've given this back to me. And thank you that you are in this business, that you will give this same kind of life back to so many. It was a striking moment of realization for me. And by the next morning, I had moved inside, and I have been back ever since. So what are the results? Well, a complete resolution of all those concussion symptoms that I mentioned and 100 others that we didn't have time for. I'm fully recovered in all ways. And we additionally treated some lifelong attention difficulties, so that I like to think I'm smarter now than even before the crash. I would like to bring up a couple of stories. I've left them in the back, so I'll have to do this extemporaneously. I have a woman that wrote to me, because my story is done, but there's so many out there that still have this same story that I've been telling you about. And a woman wrote to me and she said, thank you, Dr. Elliott. I read my story in your words. I've gone to my parents and I've gone to my friends and I said, read this book. This is what happened to me. This is my story. She wrote and said, I'm storming back to my neurologist's office this afternoon and tell him, you see, I wasn't making it up all these years. This is what happened to me. Read this book because this is me too. I had a man in his 40s write to me and say, our mother was in a car crash. She's in her 80s. She started to deteriorate quite a lot, and she kept telling us, It's not that I'm getting old. It's the car crash. It's the car crash that did this to me. But we thought, she's in her 80s, she's old, she's getting senile. You know, it's not what she thinks. But then we read in the book all of what you were going through, and over again we saw her story and your story. And we realized, oh my God, what a mistake we have made. We followed the neurodevelopmental optometric testing, and the results, like in your book, were positive, and she is now on her way back to us. And he said, thank you for giving your mother back to us. And another disturbing story, I hear these often from these blast victims in the military. And he wrote and said something of the nature, Dr. Elliott, I can't tell you how important it is to me to have read your book. You were the first person in 6 years that believes the hell I'm going through. I know it was from the blast, but they don't believe me. They send me to a psychiatrist. They tell me to sort out my emotional problems, and they tell me to take Vicodin. But you know it was a head injury. And I hear from them over and over again. And lastly, I heard from an MD, and he said, Dr. Elliott, I am haunted by all of these patients that I've seen over the years. They stretch down the block and around the corner. And I see their faces when I wake up in the morning, when I go to sleep at night this week, and I think over and over again, they were head injuries, and I miss them. And he said, never again, never again. Now I know what to look for. These are the people that you have to reach. We might ask, why are patients so positive? I hear over and over again from people that write me, hundreds and hundreds of email messages, and people stop me on the street and they call me, and they say, I got vision therapy. It's working. Or they'll tell me, I saw Debbie Zielinski and Donald E. Marcus, and I hear this lopsided spectrum that runs from, oh my goodness, I've got my life back, I can't believe it, after a decade, to the other end of the spectrum is still positive. And they'll say, I'm not well, or my concussion, my daughter who got a soccer concussion is not well, but for the first time we're seeing progress and we are so helpful. And I thought, these are brain injuries. Surely we're going to have lots of cases where we can't treat them. The brain is so very complex. So being a scientist, I'm suspicious, and I wrote to some people that I knew were going to go see Donald E. Marcus and Debbie Zielinski, thinking that they just were too embarrassed to write to me and say that it hadn't helped them. But I saw the same spectrum. Everywhere from the best thing I ever did, I've gotten my life back, to we're on the right track. And I thought, how could this be? Why are patients so positive? And then I thought about it. People don't usually complain when you give them glasses and they can see again, right? Well, similarly, I think very few people will complain when you give them glasses and they get their brains and their lives back. I guess it's simple. This is well-established science. The book has been endorsed by the Dean Emeritus of the Harvard School of Medical Education and past president of the American College of Physicians. Also by a cognitive scientist with more than 20,000 scholarly references to his original work. Also by many frontline practitioners such as emergency room medicine professors, emergency medicine professors, whiplash trauma specialists, and so on. So I want to tell you, on behalf of the 5,000 people a day who suffer concussion every day in the United States, 5,000 more concussions. On behalf of the 6 million people in the United States known to be living with the long-term effects of brain injury, thank you for the dedication that you are showing in improving our lives.